Action Park, New Jersey. From 1978 to 1996, a water and adventure park in the hills of Vernon, New Jersey, operated under a philosophy that no other major amusement facility in the country was willing to adopt. Let the guests control the action and keep the lawyers away from the rides. Action Park, owned by a disgraced former stockbroker named Gene Mulvihill, who had been banned from Wall Street, was designed to feel dangerous. The Alpine slide sent riders down a fiberglass track on small carts with brakes that worked inconsistently and speed that depended entirely on how much the rider chose to lean. The Cannonball Loop ran riders through a fully vertical 360-degree loop inside an enclosed water slide, a ride so violent in testing that staff were reportedly offered $100 cash to test it before a public opening, and came out with cuts and missing teeth. The wave pool, nicknamed the Grave Pool by locals, had waves that ran for 20 continuous minutes, used fresh water instead of salt water, making buoyancy more difficult, and required lifeguards to perform dozens of rescues on a busy day. Between 1978 and 1996, at least 6 people died at Action Park. George Larson Jr., 19, was thrown from the Alpine slide and hit his head on a rock in 1984, days before he was supposed to serve as his brother's best man. George Lopez, 15, drowned in the wave pool in 1982. Jeffrey Nathan, 27, drowned the same year after his kayak flipped, and he made contact with an electrified section of the kayak experience attraction where live wires had been installed near the water to simulate whitewater conditions. Donald DePass, 20, drowned in the wave pool in 1984. Gregory Grandchamps, 18, drowned in the wave pool in 1987. Mulvihill's response to each death was the same legal misdirection, fraudulent liability insurance set up in the Cayman Islands, and a public posture of denial. No executive ever faced criminal charges or served jail time for any of the deaths. The park closed in 1996 due to financial collapse rather than regulatory shutdown. A 2020 documentary series on HBO brought the story to a new generation and became one of the most watched documentary premieres the platform had ever recorded. Fabio Apollo's Chariot, Busch Gardens, 1999. On March 30th, 1999, the Busch Gardens Amusement Park in Williamsburg, Virginia, held a grand opening ceremony for its newest roller coaster, Apollo's Chariot, a steel hypercoaster designed to reach speeds of 73 miles per hour. To attract media attention, the park invited Italian-American supermodel Fabio Lanzoni, one of the most recognizable faces in the country at the time, to take the inaugural ceremonial ride in the front row while cameras rolled. The ride reached its top speed on the first major descent, passing just a few feet above a pond at the base of the drop. A Canada goose, flying across the park at exactly the wrong altitude, collided directly with Fabio's face at approximately 73 miles per hour. The bird died instantly. Fabio was left with deep lacerations across his nose, blood covering his face and the front of his shirt visibly in shock when the ride returned to the station. He was transported by limousine to a nearby hospital where he received stitches. No one else on the ride was seriously injured. The incident, captured in full and part cameras and broadcast footage, became one of the most widely circulated pieces of amusement park footage in history, though at the time it was largely treated as a darkly comic celebrity mishap rather than a genuine safety event. Fabio later said he considered it a miracle that he had not been killed, arguing that at that speed and angle, a bird strike to the temple or throat could have been fatal, rather than just deeply unpleasant. The goose's carcass was found in the park the following day. The park opened to ordinary guests without further incident. Fabio later said the experience had made him genuinely frightened of the ride, not because of anything the park had done wrong, but because a goose had crossed the flight path at the exact moment and exact altitude to make the collision unavoidable. A combination of variables that no safety system in the world is designed to prevent. The incident raised a narrow but real question that aviation had already spent decades studying at very high speeds. Even a relatively small bird strike can deliver fatal force, and roller coasters operating at 70 miles per hour or above along fixed low-altitude corridors pass through airspace that birds use every single day. No formal industry standard addressing bird strike risk for amusement rides exists. Indiana Beach Monon Connection derailment. On June 1st, 2003, at Indiana Beach Amusement Park in Monticello, Indiana, a wooden roller coaster called the Cornball Express was running its normal operations when a wheel assembly failed on one of the cars, causing it to derail mid-ride. 7 people were injured. However, a far more serious event occurred on the park's Manon Connection roller coaster in 2003 when a car carrying 10 passengers derailed on a curve, sending passengers lurching violently from their seats. Among those injured were riders who struck the ride structure during the derailment, sustaining fractures and soft tissue damage. State inspectors later found evidence of metal fatigue and inadequate maintenance records, spanning several inspection cycles, suggesting the mechanical failure had been developing for a period well beyond the previous safety inspection date. The Indiana Department of Homeland Security opened an investigation and issued a temporary closure order for the specific ride. The park, which had operated continuously since 1926, was ultimately sold and changed ownership in the aftermath of a broader financial review that highlighted aging infrastructure across multiple attractions. The incident became part of a national conversation in 2003 and 2004 about the inconsistency of amusement ride regulation across American states, where standards for inspection frequency, inspector qualifications, and reporting requirements differed so dramatically that a ride considered unsafe in one state could operate legally in another with no modifications. At the time, roughly half of all U.S. states had no independent inspectors for amusement rides at fixed parks, relying instead on self-reporting by operators or inspections conducted by insurers with a financial interest in keeping parks open and paying premiums. Federal oversight of fixed amusement rides specifically did not and still does not exist in the United States, where the Consumer Product Safety Commission has jurisdiction over traveling carnival rides, but not permanent park installations. Alton Towers, the Smiler, 2015. On June 2nd, 2015, the Smiler roller coaster at Alton Towers theme park in Staffordshire, England, was having a difficult day before the accident even happened. The ride, a record-holding coaster, marketed as the world's first with 14 inversions, had been experiencing intermittent technical faults since morning. Engineers had been called twice to reset stalled trains. The park, extremely busy that day, was determined to maximize capacity, and a decision was made to introduce a 5th train into the circuit to increase throughput. An empty test train was sent around the track to check the circuit. It stalled in the middle of the course and could not be remotely cleared. A second empty train was sent and manually pushed by engineers until it engaged the track system on its own. It also stalled this time in a different section. Neither empty train had been formally confirmed as cleared from the track before the ride's operators. Misreading a system status message as confirmation that the circuit was clear sent a fully loaded passenger train carrying 16 people around the same circuit. The loaded train rounded a bend and found an empty car sitting stationary directly ahead of it. Passengers described watching in disbelief as they realized what was about to happen. The impact at speed was described in court as equivalent to a 90-mile-per-hour car collision. 4 people in the front rows suffered devastating leg injuries. 2 young women, Vicky Balch, 19, and Leah Washington, 17, each lost a leg to amputation. Leah's boyfriend, Joe Pugh, 18, shattered both kneecaps. 13 other passengers were also injured. The park operator, Merlin Attractions, admitted breaching health and safety law and was fined £5 million, at the time the largest fine ever imposed for a theme park safety breach in the United Kingdom. The judge described it as a needless and avoidable accident and found that the fault lay not with any individual, but with a systemic failure to ensure safe operating procedures were followed. Leah and Joe later became engaged and announced their wedding publicly. The ride eventually reopened in 2016 with redesigned safety protocols. Verrückt Waterslide Schlitterbahn 2016. On August 7th, 2016, at the Schlitterbahn Water Park in Kansas City, Kansas, a 10-year-old boy named Caleb Schwab rode the park's signature attraction, a 168-foot-tall water slide called Verrückt, the German word for insane. Caleb was the son of a sitting Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab, who had been given free family passes to the park as part of a promotional event. The slide, billed as the tallest in the world when it opened in 2014, sent riders down a near vertical drop at speeds approaching 70 miles per hour, then up and over a second hump before descending into a finishing pool. The multi-person raft Caleb rode with two adult women became airborne on the second hump and struck a metal pole and the netting system overhead that was meant to prevent ejection. Caleb was killed. The two women suffered serious facial injuries. He was following all posted rider instructions at the time of the accident. What the subsequent investigation revealed was more disturbing than the accident itself. Whistleblowers came forward to reveal that similar airborne incidents had been occurring since the ride's opening, that specific rafts, known to behave worse than others, had been temporarily removed but returned to circulation, and that the ride's designers, who had no formal engineering qualifications in amusement park design, had built it with no meaningful technical oversight. A grand jury indictment later described Verrückt as having violated nearly all aspects of long-standing industry safety standards and called it a deadly weapon. Criminal charges were filed against the park's co-owner and several executives. The legal proceedings were complicated by procedural challenges, and the co-owner died before the criminal case concluded. Caleb's family settled with Schlitterbahn and its manufacturers for nearly $20 million. The ride was demolished in 2019. Dreamworld Thunder River Rapids 2016. On October the 25th, 2016, at Dreamworld, Australia's largest theme park on the Gold Coast of Queensland, 4 adults from what appeared to be a single extended family group were riding the Thunder River Rapids attraction, a whitewater raft simulation that had operated at the park for 30 years and was marketed as a family ride, suitable for guests as young as 2. Midway through the afternoon, a water pump near the end of the ride's circuit malfunctioned, dropping the water level in the channel. The drop in water caused an empty, unattended raft to drift from its mooring and become beached against the ride's exit conveyor system. The occupied raft, carrying the 4 adults and 2 children, a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, collided with the stationary empty raft 3 times before the impact caused it to flip backward onto the conveyor belt. The 4 adults, Kate Goodchild, her brother Luke Dorset, his partner Ruzi Aragi, and family friend Cindy Lowe, were crushed almost instantly when the conveyor mechanism closed over them. The 2 children were thrown clear by the collision and managed to get themselves to safety. They watched what happened to the adults from the water. An operator in the unload area had access to an emergency stop button that could have halted the conveyor belt within 2 seconds. It was not pressed. The ride had already malfunctioned twice earlier that same afternoon. Park policy at the time required 3 malfunctions in a day before a mandatory shutdown, so staff had simply reset the pumps and continued operating. A coroner's inquiry later found that a water level sensor capable of detecting the pump failure and triggering an automatic safety stop could have been installed for less than 3,000 Australian dollars. It had never been fitted. The park operator, Ardent Leisure, pleaded guilty to safety breaches and was fined 3.6 million Australian dollars. A coroner described the deaths as the result of systemic failure in relation to all aspects of safety. Six Flags Over, Georgia, Batman decapitation. On June 28, 2008, at Six Flags Over Georgia, near Atlanta, 17-year-old Asia Ferguson and her friend climbed a restricted fence and entered a safety zone near the Batman the Ride roller coaster. The area was clearly marked with multiple warning signs and enclosed by a fence specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access. Asia, who had reportedly lost a shoe on the ride and was attempting to retrieve it, had crossed 2 separate fences to reach the area beneath the ride's path. She was struck by the coaster as it passed overhead and was killed. The incident drew immediate attention to the behavior of the guest. Rather than any mechanical failure, the ride was operating exactly as designed, and the restricted area she entered was fenced for precisely this reason. However, the investigation that followed raised harder questions about the effectiveness of perimeter fencing at parks that operate extremely high-speed rides in relatively densely configured layouts, and about how parks communicated the nature of the risks beyond signs that could be ignored. Six Flags faced civil litigation from the family and reviewed restricted zone barriers at multiple installations in the aftermath. The case entered the broader public discussion about shared responsibility between amusement parks and guests who knowingly bypass safety infrastructure, a debate that has never reached a settled legal conclusion across American jurisdictions. Six Flags pointed to its own fencing and signage as evidence of adequate warning. The family's legal team argued that parks have an obligation to design their safety perimeters in ways that account for predictable human behavior, including the predictable behavior of teenagers who drop belongings on rides and then try to retrieve them. The two sides settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The broader question how much responsibility a park bears when a guest crosses a barrier marked with warnings continues to be litigated case by case across the country. Hydra, The Revenge, Dorney Park, 2023. On August 11th, 2023, at Dorney Park in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a roller coaster called Hydra, The Revenge stopped mid-circuit with passengers on board, a relatively routine operational event at any large coaster that is normally resolved without incident. However, during the evacuation procedure that followed, a guest identified as a 53-year-old man fell from the ride structure to the ground below. He was airlifted to a hospital with serious injuries and later died. Pennsylvania State Police and park investigators examined the incident and the ride's evacuation procedures. The case raised questions about the consistency of staff training for mid-circuit evacuations, which are among the more complex and higher-risk situations park staff encounter, particularly when guests who may be anxious, disoriented, or physically compromised need to be guided through walkways or stairs on elevated portions of a roller coaster structure. Dorney Park, owned by Cedar Fair at the time, closed the ride pending investigation. The specific finding of what caused the man to fall during the evacuation was not publicly released in full, though reports indicated that the park's own investigation and the state investigation had reached different preliminary conclusions about the sequence of events. The Dorney Park incident highlighted a gap in public awareness. Most people assume that mid-ride stoppages are the most dangerous scenarios in coaster operations. In reality, evacuation procedures are among the most frequently cited contributors to serious injury at fixed parks because they place guests in elevated, unfamiliar environments and ask them to move in ways the ride was not designed to facilitate, relying on staff training and guest compliance in conditions that are inherently anxiety-provoking. Ohio State Fair Fireball Ride Collapse. On July 26, 2017, at the Ohio State Fair in Columbus, a thrill ride called the Fireball, a swinging pendulum attraction that carries riders in a bar-shaped gondola to heights of more than 40 feet while spinning in an arc, failed during operation with a full load of passengers. A support arm of the ride fractured without warning, sending the gondola swinging free of its arcs and ejecting multiple riders into the air. One person, Tyler Jarrell, 18, was killed when he was flung from the ride and struck the ground. 7 others were injured, several seriously. Video of the incident captured by bystanders and immediately circulated online showed the gondola breaking apart mid-swing and was widely described as some of the most disturbing footage of a theme park accident ever captured on a mobile phone. Investigators traced the cause to corrosion that had eaten through the ride's weld seams to a depth that made the structural failure inevitable under normal operating loads. The corrosion had been developing for an extended period and was concentrated in areas that were difficult to inspect visually without disassembly. The ride had passed inspection before the fair opened. Its manufacturer, KMG of the Netherlands, issued a global safety alert within days and recommended inspection of all rides of the same model worldwide. Several were found with similar corrosion and taken out of service. The Ohio Department of Agriculture, which regulates amusement rides at state fairs, reviewed its inspection methodology. Tyler Jarrell had graduated from high school just weeks before his death and had planned to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. 9 incidents across 5 decades, 4 countries, and every category of theme park attraction from a wave pool to a wooden slide to a roller coaster evacuation. What connects them is not bad luck. Action Park killed people because its owner treated regulation as an enemy and built attractions no formal engineer had ever approved. The Smiler injured 5 people because a status message was misread and no one stopped to verify before sending a loaded train into an occupied circuit. Verrückt killed a 10-year-old because two people with no engineering credentials built the world's tallest water slide and then kept it open after they already knew rafts were going airborne. Dreamworld's conveyor killed 4 adults because a $3,000 sensor had never been fitted, and a policy allowed a malfunctioning ride 2 free failures before requiring a shutdown. In almost every case, the people who died had done everything right. They rode the rides they were allowed to ride. They stood in line. They followed the instructions posted on the signs and broadcast by the ride operators. The things that killed them were already present before they arrived, assembled by decisions made in boardrooms and engineering meetings and budget reviews and inspection sign-offs that they were never part of, never consulted on, and never told about. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.